A 9-year-old girl with Down syndrome crossed the ceremonial barrier at Horse Guards parade. According to strict protocol, the Royal Guard should have intervened immediately, but Lance Corporal Myles Doran didn't move. What followed challenged everything people thought they knew about duty, protocol, and what it truly means to protect. Before we dive into the story, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning light filtered weakly through London's grey clouds, casting a pale silver sheen over Horse Guards parade. Cold air clung to the stone, visible in every breath, as tourists shuffled slowly behind the ceremonial chains, hands buried deep in coat pockets. It was the kind of day where sound traveled too far. Each step on the damp pavement echoed off the centuries-old walls. The red tunics looked even more vivid under the moody sky, and every piece of polished brass gleamed like it had been touched by starlight. It was perfect weather for ceremony, sharp, formal, and unforgiving. Lance Corporal Myles Doran had been at his post since dawn. At 38, standing 6'3", he exuded the stillness that came from 15 years of service and 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan. His uniform revealed none of the scars, a thin white line along his left temple from shrapnel, deeper marks on his hands that no gloves could hide. He'd earned his place in the household division the hard way, first through Royal Marines training, then passing the selection for ceremonial duty, something less than 2% of applicants ever achieve. Many assumed standing guard in ceremonial uniform was easier than the battlefield, but those people had never tried holding absolute still for 4 hours, maintaining total alertness, knowing even a momentary lapse could risk the safety of those nearby. He found it ironic. In Helmand, he had shielded fellow soldiers from roadside bombs and insurgents. Here in London, his role was to protect tourists from themselves and from interrupting centuries of tradition. Both jobs required the same critical skill, knowing when to act and when not to. But in Afghanistan, the rules of engagement were clear. Here, every decision carried the weight of centuries-old expectations, and while standing still for hours, demanded immense discipline. The true challenge was knowing when to break that stillness, when to override instinct with duty. That morning, his judgment would be tested in a way no training could have prepared him for. Behind the black iron chains, a little girl pressed close, her eyes wide with wonder. 9-year-old Sophie Harding, blonde pigtails slightly lopsided from the morning rush, wore a pink coat with ladybug buttons handpicked by her mom just for this trip. Her gaze followed every movement in the courtyard with intense focus and pure joy, the kind only children know, the kind that finds magic in the ordinary. Sophie had Down syndrome, and this was her very first visit to London from their home in Gloucestershire. The trip had been planned for months. She called it her birthday present, even though her birthday wasn't until December. In preparation, she'd read stacks of library books about the Royal Guards, practiced marching in the backyard, and peppered her parents with questions about why soldiers stood still and whether they ever got tired. The night before they left, Sophie had laid out her best dress and swapped it for her second best one. The best one's for the Queen, she said. The second best one is for the Guards. Her logic was sweet and unshakable. On this chilly morning, Sophie had insisted on wearing that second best dress beneath her pink coat, because soldiers deserve respect. She told her father with perfect seriousness. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "that one's the strongest." Jonathan Harding followed her gaze. It landed on Lance Corporal Myles Doran. All around them, tourists buzzed, snapping photos, whispering, and trying to provoke a reaction from the guards. Teenagers made goofy faces, hoping to catch a smirk on camera. But Sophie wasn't distracted by any of it. She was focused, solemn. "Still, they're all strong, sweetheart," her father said gently, adjusting his camera strap. "No," she replied, "absolute in the way only a child can be. That one's different." And she was right. What set Doran apart wasn't just his height or his perfect military bearing. It was something deeper, something most people missed. It was the way his eyes moved. He never broke character, never let it show, but behind the stillness, he was always scanning, always aware. Combat veterans don't switch off, not really. Even in ceremonial uniform, even surrounded by tourists instead of hostiles, instincts remained sharp. He read crowds like other soldiers read terrain, watching for tension, spotting danger and nuance. Sophie couldn't know any of that, but somehow, she saw it anyway. Was quiet, simple, barely even noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Sophie stepped forward. It wasn't sudden or hurried, just a slow, determined motion, driven by the kind of innocent confidence only children carry. Her small hands pushed past the ceremonial barrier, one foot following the other over the chain, until she was standing inside the restricted area. Just a few paces from Lance Corporal Doran, gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonathan reached out instinctively, but not fast enough. A nearby tourist shouted, "Hey!" A guide began calling for security, but Doran didn't move. Every fiber of his training told him he should have protocol demanded it. A barrier had been crossed, a rule broken. He should have raised his voice, stamped his foot, issued a warning. It would have been justified, but he didn't, because in that moment, Myles Doran didn't see a trespasser or a security risk. He saw Sophie Harding, 9 years old, in a pink coat with ladybug buttons, looking up at him like he was the most important person in the world. And she smiled, not a mischievous grin or a plea for attention, a genuine, radiant smile filled with pride and admiration. She raised a hand in salute, just like she'd practiced 100 times in the mirror. Doran didn't flinch, didn't speak, but behind the stillness, something shifted just slightly. His eyes met hers, locked a fraction of a second past where the entire parade ground seemed to hold its breath. Sophie whispered, "You're doing amazing." And that was it. That was the moment that changed everything. "Excuse me, please, my daughter." Excuse me." Jonathan's voice cracked as he tried to get past the wall of confused tourists, some turning toward the commotion, others stepping aside to slowly. Sophie was already several steps into the ceremonial zone now, her pink coat standing out like a rosebud against the cold gray morning. She approached Lance Corporal Myles Doran with that same quiet determination, unaware of the panic swelling behind her. And still he didn't move. Every onlooker expected a reaction, a barked command, a stern warning, a dramatic stomp and a loud stand back, like in the viral videos. Instead, the guard remained still, impossibly still, but his eyes followed her carefully, attentively, not with suspicion, but with something else, something closer to protection. The little girl stopped just in front of him. She tilted her head, looked up into his unblinking gaze, and smiled like he was a living statue who had waited his whole life just for her to show up. "I like your buttons," she whispered, pointing to the gleaming brass on his tunic. No answer, not a word, but Doran's posture somehow softened without shifting. Not a movement you could describe, just a subtle shift in the air around him. He wasn't reacting as a guard. He was present as a human. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Cameras stayed down. Even the most social media-obsessed tourists sensed this moment wasn't meant to be captured, only witnessed. Behind them, Morrison sat motionless in the vehicle, radio still untouched. "Hold off," he said quietly. This is different." Jonathan finally broke through to the front, breathless, heart pounding. But what he saw stopped him cold. His daughter's face turned up, beaming with the pure joy of innocent admiration, and a royal guard, trained, armed and unmoving, choosing in that exact moment not to be a rule, but a person, brushed the polished surface. But the symbolism hit like a thunderclap. She wasn't mocking, she wasn't testing him, she was connecting. Every nerve in Doran's body fired in protest. Every drill he'd ever run screamed at him to react, to correct the breach. But he didn't move, because this wasn't a breach. This was a child, trying to say thank you the only way she knew how. He didn't flinch, didn't look down. But in that moment something fundamental shifted. The parade ground, the uniforms, the centuries of tradition, they were all still there. But so was she. 9 years old, vulnerable, brave, unafraid. The world held its breath then, after a pause that felt both impossibly long and heartbreakingly brief. Sophie smiled and whispered, "You're the bravest one." Still, Doran didn't speak, but his eyes just briefly closed and reopened. A blink. And for those close enough to see it, said everything. The edge of his metal ribbon, not pulling, just noticing. "Did you get this for being brave too?" she asked. Doran glanced down, then back at her. "Something like that." Sophie nodded again, satisfied. "I think my mum would say you're a real knight." Around them, the crowd had gone completely still. No more cameras lifted, no one spoke. Even the birds seemed to hold back their cries, as if nature itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Myles Doran, a royal guard who once carried a wounded corporal 3 kilometers under enemy fire, remained there, on one knee, not because he was ordered to, but because in that moment, this child and her quiet recognition of his humanity was all that mattered. And that choice, that defiance of tradition in favor of something deeper, more human, would become a moment remembered long after the crowd had gone. After the brass had tarnished, after the tourists had moved on, because one soldier chose compassion over protocol and changed what service really looked like. Gently around her shoulder, his voice soft. "You did well, sweetheart." Sophie looked up at him, beaming. "He's my favorite soldier now. I think he might be everyone's," Jonathan replied, glancing back at Doran, still at attention, still silent, but somehow transformed in the eyes of everyone present. The ministry official, sensing the mood, scribbled something hurriedly on his clipboard and stepped away without another word. He'd write a report, surely. There'd be discussions, maybe even disciplinary reviews. But something deeper had already been decided. The crowd began to disperse slowly, quietly, not with the usual chatter, but in a hush that bordered on reverence, as if leaving a memorial, not a tourist attraction. Doran remained at his post, posture perfect, expression unreadable. But behind the stoicism was a man who had made a choice and, in doing so, redefined what it meant to serve, not just the crown, not just the tradition, but the people, especially the small ones who still believe that heroes stand in red coats and tall black hats and sometimes kneel when it matters most. Firmly, his voice rising, "You're not allowed in this area. You've breached a secured perimeter." Sophie whimpered, eyes wide and brimming with tears. Jonathan stepped in instantly, his tone sharp but composed. "Take your hand off my daughter. She's a child. She didn't do anything wrong." The tourists around them reacted with shock, a few gasps breaking the tense silence. Several lifted their phones, not to snap tourist shots this time, but to document what was starting to feel like an overreaction. Doran's voice cut through the square like a blade. "Constable." It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of command. Everyone turned onward. Doran had not moved from his post. His posture was still regulus and perfect, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd seen real combat, someone who'd understood the difference between discipline and brutality. Constable Donnelly hesitated, his grip on Sophie loosening slightly. "She is not a threat," Doran said evenly, "and she has already been addressed. Stand down." Donnelly blinked, the certainty in his eyes faltering for the first time. "I was told there was a breach." "There was," Doran interrupted, "and it was handled. You were escalating a resolved situation. Release the child." Another beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, Donnelly stepped back, releasing Sophie's arm. She shrank into her father's side, trying to disappear from the tension radiating around her. An older couple near the front of the crowd clapped softly. Others joined in, not the applause of entertainment, but of appreciation, of solidarity. Donnelly looked around, realizing how many eyes were on him, how many phones were recording. The moment had slipped away from him, and he knew it. Jonathan held Sophie close, offering comfort and a tight, protective hug. "It's okay, love. You didn't do anything wrong." Sophie looked up at the guard, again at Doran, who had spoken up for her when it mattered most. She smiled through the tears that hadn't fallen, and Doran, without breaking his stance, gave the tiniest nod. The square returned to stillness, but not the same kind as before. This was a deeper, quiet, layered with meaning, a silent acknowledgement that something profound had just happened. Not just a moment of kindness or conflict, a moment of clarity about rules, compassion, and what true service looks like. Security perimeter, her crisp uniform catching the pale morning light. She moved with unhurried confidence, her boots silent against the stone. As the ranking officer on site, her presence shifted the energy instantly. "Constable Donnelly," she said firmly, stepping between him and the crowd. "Stand down immediately." Donnelly stiffened. "But ma'am, there was a—" "I've reviewed the report. I've seen the footage," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "The situation was resolved before you arrived. Your actions escalated a peaceful conclusion into a public disturbance." He hesitated, then finally stepped back, his face flushed, not with shame, but with frustration at being called out. Yet his mouth stayed shut. Captain Harlan turned to Doran and gave a nod of quiet acknowledgement. "Lance Corporal, return to your post. You acted with discretion and restraint. The matter will be noted accordingly." Doran didn't move right away. Instead, he looked down at Sophie, still clinging to her father. "I'm sorry you were scared," he said gently. Sophie peeked up and gave a small, watery smile. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder and whispered, "Say thank you." Sophie looked at Doran and whispered, "Thank you for protecting me." The royal guard inclined his head slightly, then turned and marched back to his post. His movements were sharp, controlled, but there was something different in the way he stood now. A deeper gravity earned in front of hundreds. Captain Harlan stepped to the rope barrier and addressed the crowd. "What you saw today was not a breach. It was a moment of human decency," she said. "And let this be a reminder that discipline is not only about rules, it's about judgment." The crowd responded with a respectful round of applause, not raucous, but warm, meaningful. Jonathan knelt beside Sophie again, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You okay?" She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "He's the bravest one, isn't he?" Jonathan smiled. "Yeah, he really is." And as the crowd began to disperse, the square settling back into its ceremonial rhythm, the story of one girl, one soldier, and one moment of courage had already begun to echo far beyond the stones of Horse Guards parade. The rule book. Sophie gave a small, grateful smile, her trust restored in the face of calm authority. Jonathan swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Captain Harlan stood, gave a respectful nod to them both, then turned on her heel and walked away, her posture straight, her presence leaving a wake of silent respect behind her. Across the square, the ceremonial rhythm resumed. Tourists, still hushed, slowly returned to their observations. Some snapped quiet photos. Others simply stood reflecting on what they'd witnessed. Myles Doran remained motionless at his post, the model of composure once again, but something had shifted, not in his posture but in the perception of everyone. Watching, he wasn't just a guard anymore, he was a protector in the truest sense of the word. And as Sophie squeezed her father's hand and they turned to leave the square, her little voice carried one final, quiet observation. "He's not just brave, Daddy, he's kind." Jonathan nodded. "Yes, love, and the world needs both." As Harlan walked away, the square began to empty slowly. No one hurried, no one spoke above a whisper. What they'd witnessed wasn't just a child meeting a guard, it was a lesson in the difference between following rules and doing what's right, between authority and leadership, between procedure and humanity. Sophie looked back at Doran one final time, He stood exactly as he had that morning, rifle shouldered, eyes forward, expression neutral. But something had changed. Something invisible, yet unmistakable. The tourists weren't just looking at a ceremonial figure anymore. They were seeing a man who had chosen humanity over protocol, protection over procedure. An elderly man with a military bearing approached Jonathan as they neared the edge of the crowd. "That was the right guard to meet," he said quietly, his accent carrying the weight of years served. "Most would have followed the book. Not many would have followed their consciences who was kind to her," Jonathan replied. "That's all that mattered." The man nodded. Kindness is the highest form of courage, especially when it costs you something. As they reached the edge of the square, Sophie tugged on her father's hand. "Daddy, yes, sweetheart." "He knew my name." Jonathan smiled, remembering that simple moment of human connection that somehow changed everything. "He's a good soldier." "The best," Sophie agreed. Behind them, Lance Corporal Myles Doran remained at his post until the ceremony ended. He never moved again that day, never spoke again, never broke protocol again. He didn't need to be, because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or words. Sometimes they're won by a single moment of choosing to see a child instead of a problem, protection instead of procedure, humanity instead of protocol. Sometimes being a guard means knowing when to stand firm, and sometimes it means knowing when to kneel. Would you have done what Doran did, broken protocol to protect a child's dignity? Should guards be trained to use judgment over procedure in situations like this? And what about that constable? What would you have done if you saw someone in uniform treat a frightened child that way? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story changed how you see ceremonial soldiers, hit that like button to show your respect. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful moments that remind us what service really means. And if you know someone who thinks these guards are just for show, share this with them. Because today proved that behind every ceremony stands a human being who understands that some things matter more than rules. Our next story is already waiting. Click and keep watching. We'll see you at the same time tomorrow.